Hello, everyone, and welcome to this bonus episode of Meet the Farmers, which is being made in association with Nethergill Associates, who are a specialist farm consultancy based in Devon. And today we're asking quite a big question, and I'm sure it's a question that a lot of you will be very interested in from different points of view. But that question is, what is the maximum profit potential of your farm business? And indeed, is it actually possible to work this out? Well, further, for years, nature's been seen by some as an economic burden on farms, that somehow, in order to boost biodiversity, this has to come at an economic cost to the farm business. Well, we'll also be challenging that notion today. I'm joined by Chris Clark and Brian Scanlon from Nethergill Associates. Chris and Brian argue that far from being a business burden, nature has a critical role to play in supporting farm profitability. And over the last 4 years, Nethergill Associates has worked with nearly 200 farms to show that farm businesses can improve their overall resilience by seeking what they call a farm's maximum sustainable output, or MSO. We're going to be talking about that a lot today, so remember that acronym. MSO is the sweet spot in which a farm business will be at its most profitable, nature will be at its most optimized. And Chris and Brian calculate it using mathematics. Their research has shown that with high input, high output systems, farms will actually often experience lower profitability or even lack of profitability following support payments. However, once work has been done to ensure a balance between food production and nature, farms become more profitable and nature is also restored. But can you really have your cake and eat it? And if yes, should we be seeing nature and profitability on farms in a different light, especially at a time of policy change in the UK? So I told you that it was going to be a big subject, and it certainly is, but that is what we're discussing today. I'm really pleased to have Chris and Brian with me today. Chris, Brian, welcome to Meet the Farmers. Thank you for doing this with me.
Morning, Ben.
Let's dive straight in, just so the listeners can get an idea of your backgrounds first of all. And Chris, I'm going to go to you first. Just give a brief introduction to you and your background. But you actually have been on the podcast before, so hopefully long-standing listeners will already know you.
Thanks, Ben. I have been on before, but a brief resume is non-generational farmer, following agricultural college, farm manager, tenant, retrained in business management and marketing, and ended up buying a farm in North Yorkshire. And that the consultancy, well, we had that farm in North Yorkshire continued, and it is that consultancy which started off working with all sorts of different types of businesses, from subprime mortgages through to logistics, has now concentrates on farm business management.
Brilliant, nice and succinct. Thank you. And Brian, you have quite an interesting background, especially for this podcast. We don't have many people with your background on here.
Well, I'm not I'm not a farmer. I'm a mathematician who has had a career in industry and banking. But Chris and I have worked together over the years and worked on quite a few interesting farming type issues. My industrial background covers steel making, jet engines, and heavy construction, civil engineering, and process engineering.
Excellent. And stay with us, listeners, because you will see how all of this is relevant. Chris, you did mention Nethergill Associates, but and you're then the consultancy, but just give us a little bit more detail again before we get into the guts of this, of your main focus as a consultancy.
Well, it was a general business management consultancy, but for the last 5 or 6 years, we've concentrated on one aspect, and that is the profitability and the success of farm businesses. And we have developed a series of algorithms. We've developed a series of stratagems that allow farm businesses to make decisions to where they go next and what the likely effects of those decisions are. So we concentrate entirely on farms these days. within those farms, we do other things quite often. We look at the diversification. We're working with several farms at the moment on farm shops or online selling of various farm products. So the previous management consultancy experience is still used with other aspects of a farming business. But you mentioned that we've done 200 farms, nearly 200 farms. Well, we're now over 220. And we have contracts coming up for probably 50 more before the end of the year.
Wow, you're busy guys. So we're going to go on mostly today to talk about MSO, maximum sustainable output, and your business analysis model, I suppose, in detail. But let's start by focusing on the problem, in inverted commas, namely struggling farm profitability as well as declining nature value, which are two things that certainly within the farming sector we hear about again and again and again. They're topics that we talk about a lot. So when and why did you get to the point when you decided that you needed to put this focus? You've already said that that's a large focus of your consultancy now, Chris.
So although the consultancy was running when we were farming in North Yorkshire, we were also farming. And when we bought the farm, we did all the cash flows and all the budgets that farmers are supposed to do, and that I was taught to do, and that I had honed in my business management experience. And what was really concerning was that we couldn't make any money out of sheep and beef in those days. And we tried all sorts of things, different feeds, different fertilizers, different this, different that. And then we tried reducing our output. And as we reduced our output over a period of time, we found that the profits went up, or if I'm really honest, the losses went down. We were in the Yorkshire Dales, quite a large BPS in those days, and quite a large high level stewardship. So, but the farm wasn't making money. The actual farming business wasn't making money. So without the support, we would have struggled. So that is what got the whole thing going. And I went to Brian and said, look, this is what's going on. And he said, it's not possible. This is not what happens in business. There is a standard theory which says, as you produce more, you will make more money. In farming, that doesn't happen, and we'll explore that this morning.
Indeed. Just a passing comment on that, actually, Brian, in terms of not coming from within farming and actually having this overall knowledge and actually overlook into farm businesses. Do you feel that actually in the farming sector we perhaps don't look outside as much as we should be, and we are perhaps restricted in the way that we see the world?
Not necessarily. I think it always helps, of course. But in this instance, the standard model, the standard economic model of the firm is widely known, widely accepted. It works on the principle that variable costs vary linearly with output. And that was the reason behind my comment to Chris that you can't possibly make more money by downsizing. Anyway, he said it with such conviction, I thought perhaps he's right. We'd better try and find an explanation for this. And that's the story of MSO.
Yeah. We're going to go on to discuss the detail of this, but Chris, I mean, is it possible? Because I mean, this is one of the things we're challenging today, but is it really possible to put a figure on the maximum? I'm putting the stress on the word there, the maximum profit potential of a farm business, and we're just talking about the theory, the principle of it.
So I think the question to answer first is, what does profit mean? Because profit is bandied around. So in our case, and when we're working with farms, we have several contributions which contribute to a profit. But in this case, and during this discussion, the profit will mean your variable costs and your fixed costs added up and subtracted from your output before support. We want to know, and farm businesses should want to know, how much profit, output before support minus variable and fixed costs, how much profit the farm business is contributing to whatever they're doing within that farm before support. And that is important because support is deteriorating, going down, uncertain, not knowing where we are. So as business people, and we treat farmers as business people rather than purely farmers, when we go onto a farm, we don't look at that. We don't tell a farmer how to run a farm. We look at where they are in business terms and then relate that to the farming situation that they are in. So profit is difficult, and it depends upon the size of farm. Will that profit contribute to farmer drawings, for example? So the bigger the farm, the more contribution you'll get to farmer drawings. So when you want to know what the maximum profit is, there's all sorts of criteria that need to come into this. And most farms would like to have a profit that contributes, that covers their variable costs, covers their fixed costs, and makes some contribution before support to their family drawings.
Absolutely.
The ultimate limiting factor is area. So the size of the farm is the critical limiting factor to farm profitability. Because beyond a certain point, you can't improve nature in the way that you improve productivity in a factory.
Yeah, this is absolutely key point here, isn't it? And sticking with the theory, sticking behind the idea of that, the other key thing is energy here. And listeners, again, stick with me because it may feel like we're going off on a tangent, but we're really not. Let's discuss energy because that's key to the context behind MSO. Farmers don't often see themselves as energy producers and consumers, particularly both of those things. And if anything, they use the word food producers. I'd love to say we're food producers. But why do you think it's key for them to recognize the role of energy in their business, Brian?
There's two kinds of energy that are important when looking at farming. One is the free energy that you get from natural resources, principally the sun. We call that free issue energy. And it's really quite valuable and it's quite abundant. Every square meter of the planet gets 1.38 kilowatts of sunlight energy on it when the sun is shining. So in one sense, the mission of farming is to convert that energy in the most efficient way into food products at the end of the day. The other energy component is really industrial energy, and that comes with when farmers buy in products such as fertilizers or food concentrates. And so we've got this problem of two types of energy in farming, which are driving two sets of costs. The first objective is to make sure that you use all the free issue energy. And what we found is that at the point when you've used the last amount of that, you're at the MSO point. But there are other ways of getting there too.
So Ben, we were at a DEFRA meeting in London last week, in fact. And I started off the meeting by saying that the farming industry is one of the most, if not the most important energy producer in the UK. Farmers think that they produce food, which they do, but food is a fuel, and fuel is energy, and energy that the farmers produce is subject to exactly the same laws of physics as anybody else in the energy industry, whether they're renewable energy or fossil fuel energy. The physics behind diesel and petrol for Esso and Texaco is exactly the same as the physics behind the food is a fuel, which is energy that farmers produce.
So a lot of this is about mindset shift, and one of the things that you and I, Chris, have discussed when you podcast here previously, and also when we were speaking on Nature Friendly Farming Network podcast as well, was this idea of nature being a stakeholder in your farm business. And then again, this is the other aspect of it because it is inextricably linked. But let's just, for the purposes of this podcast that we're recording at the moment, just return to that. And can you just explain the nuts and bolts about what that means by seeing nature as a stakeholder in your farm business?
Well, if I was to invest in your farming business, Ben, I would expect your farming business to pay me a dividend. Okay, and that then is a liability. There's a cost to your business because you have to pay me some sort of cash for me being a shareholder. But nature, which the revenue stream that is available to farm businesses, nature gives that to farms for nothing. It is a bonus. And you need to treat that nature as a shareholder and look after it and stroke it and make it better within your farm business. Because as you look after nature, the natural capital, the revenue up to a point will increase. And if you're looking after nature, by definition, your industrial energy has gone down. And so your margins, your contributions are going to go up. Does that make sense?
Completely. No, I think that's well explained. And I think bringing it all together, that turns us towards MSO, maximum sustainable output. Just explain again what it is and particularly how it helps a farm business or how MSO in itself helps a farm business to put a figure on what it is.
Well, let's go back to what Brian was saying earlier about the standard economic theory of the firm. That does not apply in agriculture. And then it doesn't matter whether you're dairy or an arable or lowland, upland livestock, or whatever it is, it does not apply in agriculture. And we'll come on to that in a bit more detail. But if you go to the MSO, the maximum sustainable output, or what is becoming more commonly used is the sweet spot in farming. You will maximize, as a farmer, you will maximize your profit. You will optimize the nature associated with your farm business and the landscape in which your farm business works and operates. And you'll minimize the net energy burden. So there are three really strong statements which people find difficult to absorb, but you'll be more profitable, you'll optimize nature, and you'll minimize your energy burden. That's what MSO does.
And I mean, some people listening there might be two little words which are coming into their head right now, and those are natural capital. In terms of how this relates to that, how is this different, or how does it actually view natural capital as a resource?
So natural capital is available to every single farm, and it's in a form that most other industries don't have access to. This is free issue energy. 1.36, 1.38 kilowatt hours of solar energy per square meter is available whenever the sun is shining to every single farm. And as a business person, you need to be driving as much food production as you can using that. Okay, and when you do that, the natural capital, because that is what solar energy is, that the solar energy will drive carbon, it'll drive fertility, it'll drive all sorts of things. It drives revenue, it reduces variable costs, it reduces the amount of industrial energy, and it doesn't matter whether you are overproducing on your farm or underproducing. The MSO is the point where you optimize your nature, you maximize your profitability, and you reduce your net energy burden.
It might at this point, Ben, be useful to reflect on why farming has a different model to the standard model. Essentially, what we've done is to split what was thought to be a single linear variable cost into two components. One we've called productive variable costs, which are those costs associated with working with nature. And the second set we've called corrective variable costs, which are those associated with substituting for nature. In a shorthand form, the PVC's productive variable costs are all to do with free issue sunlight energy. And the CVC's, the correctives, are all to do with the inputs of industrial energy. In a logical business operation, you would exploit your PVCs until they run out, and then you would incur your CVCs. That inflection point is the MSO point on a farm. Natural capital has to have, if it's capital, it has to have a value. it's no good talking about capital in qualitative terms, because you run into problems like how many worms equal a lapwing. Capital is a sterling value issue. And what we can say is that the primary natural capital on a farm is the pre-support revenue minus its productive variable costs. And for that, which is an income stream, and for that income stream to be capitalized by turning it, through effectively a price earnings ratio into a capital sum. That's your natural capital, your primary natural capital. And what you find is that as you work with CVCs and as your administrative costs come in, you are continuously attenuating that natural capital on the farm. So the mission is to preserve as much of it as possible.
Chris, Brian's given us an insight then into some of the equation, I suppose, behind what you're doing. But for any listener out there who's thinking, okay, so if Chris and Brian come out onto my farm and they're analyzing my business, what are they actually going to be doing? What's the process? Can you just take us through that?
It's actually relatively simple. Every farm, every business will have a set of statutory accounts. But those statutory accounts produced by chartered accountants are there to mitigate a tax liability. They aren't there really, and shouldn't really be used, although farmers do use it, as a business management tool. The key is to, while these statutory accounts are there to mitigate tax, that they aren't primarily there to drive business decisions to increase profit. So we create a set of management accounts. And we do that through creating a hierarchy. So we look at the output of a farm, and we take the support off that, if there's anything within that revenue line, and put it back in later on. So revenue without support. We then look at the variable costs, and those are split into two, as Brian has just described. The PVCs, the productive variable costs working with nature, and the CVCs, corrective variable costs substituting for nature. And as an aside, they're called corrective because farms use that industrial energy, those CVCs, to correct for the disadvantages on that farm, whether it be elevation or latitude or precipitation or whatever it is. So you take your output, pre-support output, subtract your variable cost, and you have your first contribution. Now, 18 to 20% of the farms that we have reviewed are negative at that point.
Yeah.
Pre-support. And because they don't have this hierarchy of contributions in place, then their support is also in the revenue line, they don't understand that their business is in real trouble. And there could be an argument that this business should not be supported because it is fundamentally flawed. So once you've got your contribution, your level 1 contribution, you then take the fixed costs off. And so you then end up with a second contribution. And at the moment, 200 plus farms, 80% of the farms do not have a positive contribution, second contribution, which is output minus variable costs minus fixed costs. 80% do not have a positive contribution before support at that point. They have no contribution to the family drawings, to finance charges, to CapEx, capital expenditure, no contribution before support. The whole industry has been predicated, which has been encouraged by accountants, to base your business on farming the support. There's every chance in the future that we will not be able to do that. And farmers, in our view, should be taking control of their business, taking control away from the state, putting it back in the hands of farmers themselves.
I mean, that is quite an astounding figure, isn't it? And clearly you haven't been, in terms of time, you haven't been doing this for that long, really, in terms of working with clients. But for those that you have seen, once a client has that knowledge, how on a practical basis, how are they then able to create a framework to improve that situation?
So, as I said earlier, it's very hard for us to go into a farm and tell them how to farm. They've been farming it quite often for generations.
Yeah.
They've forgotten more than we'll ever know about farming on their farm. So we tell them where their business is. We will produce findings and conclusions. We can work and do work with farmers on the recommendations. So there, for example, quite a big farm, 1,200 acres, 1,000 ewes, bull beef unit, and their problem started 4 or 5 years ago when they couldn't transfer their existing HLS into a new HLS.
Yep.
So their cash flow went all haywire. They started moving to MSO. They now have 350 odd ewes, 75 Belted Galloways finishing off grass now. And but I helped them make that decision, but the decision was made by them. And actually, his problem, to be somewhat trite about it in a way, is that every Friday afternoon, every Friday evening when he comes in from work, nowadays, because he's not working weekends, there's a list up there by the missus for his jobs over the weekend.
There are some common features to improvement in performance. Number one is to try and minimize or even eliminate your CVCs. Now that will involve a reduction in output, but it's our experience that that initial reduction will recover in subsequent years as output at MSO tends to grow and the fertility of the soil improves. The second thing is that fixed costs are an important element in farm profitability. Very few farms are profitable when their fixed costs are more than 40% of their pre-support revenues. And very few farms can meet that test. Those two things, together with some farming issues, those being business issues, are important. The ability to feed animals all year round on grass, the likelihood that native breeds do better than other breeds. These are other farming factors that will come into profit improvement on a farm.
Just, Brian, taking this beyond farming for a second, I mean, clearly every single business, no matter what your business is in, will have an impact on the natural world in some way. It will be exploiting some sort of resource somewhere along the chain. So what's the capacity of MSO, of this system, to actually analyze any type of business, farming or not?
Well, the MSO theory will work whenever there's an element of nature having an impact on a business. It's all about separating energy types. The problem with industrial energy is that it's not always realized, but the energy content of the input can never, ever be recovered in the output of food. That's not possible. It's an easy trap to fall into, but at the end of the day, it's an impossibility. If we were able to do that, we'd have perpetual motion machines. Now, these traps are not obvious to many people in business and industry until they're explicitly pointed out. And they do exist in farming. It's been masked by the fact that PVCs tend to dominate in terms of their contribution to profitability, and they mask the effect of CVCs unless the CVCs are excessive. And when they're excessive, farms get into trouble very, very quickly.
So, Ben, the energy that goes into fertilizer, or purchase concentrates, or sprays, or non-essential vet and med, the energy that goes into those type of commodities cannot be recovered when you sell your food with food as a fuel, fuel as energy. Not possible.
The sunk costs in many ways.
Is what, sorry?
In essence, sunk costs.
Yes, it does indeed. It has more cost than value.
Yeah. And of course, you're paying for the energy content in those inputs with a real cost. The energy content of your PVC is essentially free. You've got to husband the farm, of course, but the real contribution of energy is free to you.
Could we return to the notion of profitability for a few minutes again? I mean, Chris, at the beginning of this interview, you spoke about that, but I just want to reflect on profitability, I suppose, more in terms of the culture in farming, really. That we talk about profit and we talk about farming being a business and we talk about farm businesses increasingly, I think. But to what extent is you speak to now dozens and dozens of farms. To what extent do you see profitability as being the most important aspect of the driver of their business? Or are we always going to be in a stage where there are multiple sort of factors of success? Where does profitability sit as you see it in terms of the priority of the person running the business? It's quite a hard question.
Well, it's rare that we see profitability as a driver. What we see as the main driver is what farmers call productivity. What they actually mean is production, output. They want as much production as possible. Now, farmers have been educated and are encouraged by authorities, whether it's DEFRA, RPA, Natural England, NFU, CLA, or whoever it is, to try and produce as much as they can. That is the wrong measure. But because we have that production measure, farmers use a yardstick of how many weeds in my field, what do my walls look like, what's the fencing like, what cattle have I got, what cereals are I growing, what do my potatoes look like, and you can't see their balance sheet or their P&L account. But the P&L and the balance sheet are the only true measures of a successful business, whether it's farming or ball bearings or BMW or SO or whatever it is.
Profitability is much more fundamental than many people realize, in the sense that without profitability in the farming sector, you have no real food security. And food security is not thought of typically in terms of profitability, but in fact, it's profitability is the bedrock on which food security is founded.
If we have an industry which is inherently unprofitable, which we do, 80% don't cover their variable and fixed costs before support, then we cannot have a successful food security process. It's not possible because farming is inherently unprofitable.
Point in itself, a lot of listeners are going to be reflecting quite deeply at this point. At this point in time, let's reflect a bit on where you've come from over the last few years or so. I think with COVID in between, it's sort of skewed the viewpoint, doesn't it? But Chris, back in November 2019, you published a report funded by the RSPB, the Wildlife Trust, and the National Trust, which was titled "Less is More: Improving Profitability and the Natural Environment in Hill and Other Marginal Areas." Can you just take us back to that report, what you learned from that, but critically also reflecting since? What have you learned since then to bring us up to date with those particular ideas?
So we've covered a lot of what was in that report and what we now know. We've covered that already, but in summary, we talked about PVCs and CVCs for the first time. We didn't at that time understand the energy burden that farmers have to carry, but we looked at the profitability of farms and the hierarchy of contributions, which we've already talked about. It did concentrate on upland farms in the north of England. So and it was quite controversial. It created quite a stir, and we are still getting inquiries based on the publication of that report in 2019. We now have, just as a congruent to that, we've got a couple of reports coming out. Well, one report and a paper that is also coming out to be a peer-reviewed paper later this year to go through all this stuff. But subsequent to that report, we now calculate on farms 2 additional elements, or maybe 3. Firstly, we understand leverage. We understand what is the most important thing that a farm business can do to become more profitable. We understand that the marginal cost analysis that the industry has undertaken for the last several decades doesn't work, and you have to go to an evolution of unit costs. And marginal cost analysis only works if you have linear variable costs, and in farming we have non-linear variable costs. And the other thing we now know is the energy balance on farm. We can calculate on every farm how much free issue energy they have available, how much they need to be at their most profitable, and what happens if they go beyond that in using industrial energy, food, fertilizer, etc. And what happens if they don't get as far as MSO, that they are underproducing. Underproducing is as problematic as overproducing.
Again, another good point to reflect on. I mean, less is more, as you've said there, obviously related to upland farms, and you've worked with a lot of other farms since then. But I just almost want to focus on the uplands for a bit, because again, certainly when it comes to going to a policy level, if we look at ELMS, say, if we look at support payments and the reform of support payments, there has been um, a bit of tension, let's say that, as to how the uplands deal in comparison to lowland farms. When it comes to MSO, how democratic is this is this as a process, in terms of, obviously it's going to enable you to understand, like you were saying there, it's putting a figure on your free issue energy. But to what extent, if you look at a farm business through MSO, does this provide really more of a level playing field in terms of understanding your business when you're comparing upland and lowland farms?
Well, there's the principles apply to all farms. And the one concept that we haven't discussed, Ben, is the concept of the managed landscape. I don't know how many, what is it, 98, 98.5, 99, 99.5% of the landscape in our country is managed. And it's been managed to produce food by farmers for centuries. And as that happened incrementally over the centuries, nature has adapted and moved with and attempted to create a balance with that type of farming. We wouldn't have the hay meadows, particularly the upland hay meadows, of which there's only, I think, 10% left, of which I think 90% of those 10% are in the north of England. So without this managed landscape, we wouldn't have the type of biodiversity and habitats that we already have. So in the uplands, do we try and get back to a farming and nature equilibrium, or do we just let it rewild? And what people and others, the proponents of rewilding, have to understand is that any change in equilibrium will take up energy.
Yep.
Doing nothing takes energy.
Just returning to some of the maths on this. Obviously, when you do your analysis, say you're working with a farm, I don't know, in 2 weeks' time, and you go and do your analysis and you work out the MSO at that particular time. Brian, what are the maths on how variable your MSO is? So is it possible to, say, improve that figure over time?
It is possible. The proof comes in time when, as the farm changes its practice by adopting MSO and moving on, it reinforces the calculations, or at least it confirms the calculations on which they were based. They're all pretty sound. In general terms, the lowest MSOs we've come across are around 75% of current output, and the highest ones are around 95%. So the batting average is between 83 and 85% at the present time.
Let's turn towards food security, which we have already mentioned on the pod so far, but I think it's worth going into this in detail again, to really just try and understand again the culture behind this. So at a time when food security is particularly high on the agenda, which it certainly has been in the news for the last year or so, What is your message? And I'm going to say to both of you here, what would both of your messages to be to anyone who is still arguing that we need to focus on yield as opposed to profitability? We've already said that if a farm isn't profitable, then it undermines the whole basis of everything, including yield, because if a farm isn't profitable, then it's not sustainable going forward, and you're going to have personal issues, etc. But yeah, just a message from you to anyone who is still thinking in their mind, no, I need to still focus on yield.
Well, we get this question asked of us a lot when we're in public meetings, and I suppose the most recent one we did would have been, I did one in Cumbria, and Brian and I did one in Northern Ireland. And in Northern Ireland, there were at several meetings, farmers would stand up and say, we need to feed our country, we need to feed the world. And of course, you can't do that unless you are in existence. And the farming industry has relied entirely on support to be in existence, and that is changing. So you have to be pragmatic about this and say, our first priority is to feed our family. Our second priority is to make the business work. Those two may be interlinked significantly. But our third priority is to produce food that's going to feed the rest of the world. And you can't do that unless you run a profitable farm business. And the industry overall has to be profitable. And the current business model is not working. This drive for production does not give us the food security that we believe it does. Lastly, before Brian comes in, which I expect he'll want to, is that as you go to MSO, as you move to this sweet spot, the MSO moves to the right. It improves. And there's not a single farm where that hasn't happened. If you're overproducing and you reduce your output to move towards MSO, as you do that, particularly if you're a heavy user of fertilizer, the soil fertility changes, the soil structure changes, the mycorrhiza in the soil change. And as you do that, then the MSO moves to the right, it improves. And so for farms that we did MSO calculations on 3 or 4 or more years ago, they never achieved they never got to that low point of MSO that we calculated because everything began to improve. And we now have farms that are 95% of their output with no fertilizer use, for example. And we have an example of that. We worked on 37 farms in North Wales, where without any knowledge of what we were going to find, we found that the farms that had never used fertilizer were more profitable than the ones that were using fertilizer, and their dry matter per hectare was nearly, if not as good.
Yeah. Brian?
Yield's quite important in all businesses, but in farming, it's a question of looking for the yield through husbandry, not through additives. That's the critical difference. In many ways, it seems to me, when nitrogen is dumped onto the soil, artificial nitrogen is dumped onto the soil, it has all the characteristics of monetary inflation. The plants can only use a certain amount of it. In using the fertilizer, the nitrogen, it'll take it from the easiest route available, which is what's dumped on the soil. It neglects to take nitrogen out of the earth or out of the atmosphere. And there's a limit to it. And the more you dump on it, the more you realize that the output doesn't grow. It's just like inflation. If you start printing money, all that happens is prices go up. And that's exactly what's happening in farming.
Have you done any modeling yet on the potential for this if it were to be rolled out on a much, much broader basis in terms of what the impact actually on the industry would be?
The impact would be not only just on the industry, but on nature, on natural capital. If you go to MSO, there's going to be significant problems if we all did it all at once, because there would be a reduction in output for a period of time, and maybe we can't afford that. And again, we were discussing with DEFRA on whatever it was last week, that there should be funding for transition from where farmers are now to where they need to get to at this sweet spot. Now, whether that actually happens, who knows? But if you go to MSO all in one go, there will be a reduction in output, and that will cause us problems. So it has to be phased in. But once you get to that point, and that may be 3, 4, or 5 years later, then we will be up to somewhere very similar levels of food being farmed and produced. But not only that, natural capital will be enhanced. It may not be the sort of natural capital that a lot of people want, in that nature is being allowed to decide itself, because nature only acts in a random way. And so natural capital will be optimized for that particular type of landscape and that particular type of farm. And you could also argue that farmers, particularly livestock farmers, will be at net zero. And this is, again, contentious, but the net energy burden on that farm and therefore on society is minimized.
It's probably best to look at the issue on a community basis. We've looked at groups of farms ranging from groups of 20 to groups of 50. And what we've done is to look at the pattern of profitability. And we take their pre-support profit, in other words, their second contributions. And by simply ranking them in order and accumulating the level of profit, we produce a pattern of profitability for the local economy. Almost all these communities will grow in profit to around, I don't know, 20%, 30% of the farms involved. And then the community profitability reduces thereafter, often going negative and ending up severely negative. What we know is that when we apply MSO to those farms, we can usually cut out all the negative profitability in the community. That's the potential that we can start to offer.
Yeah. And what's important there, Brian, I think what you've alluded to is about this wider benefit. So in terms of economy, ecology, and community, because for any non-farming listeners out there, or perhaps I'm thinking specifically here of any policymakers who might be listening into this, who might be thinking, well, you know what, it's up to an individual. If we're talking about a farm business here, which is quite right in many ways, in my view, it's up to that individual farm to take hold of their own profitability in order to survive into the future, if you're taking a free market approach. But here we're actually saying that this is broader than this, that actually if we can actually improve profitability across farms, there's the potential for many more benefits. So in the context of post-Brexit UK farming policy landscape, and we talk about transition, we're still in some ways not entirely sure what we're transitioning towards, but this could be a benchmark. Why might MSO be relevant in policy context still, and why do you still want to have these conversations with policymakers?
Well, first of all, I think MSO could be used as a target for the award of grants and support. If farms were incentivized to get to MSO with increasing incentivization for the closer they get, that would be very valuable. It would also work very well if the incentivization for those above MSO was greater than those below MSO. Being below MSO is a bigger problem at the end of the day for food security and other things. And particularly in the sense that people below MSO are wasting natural resources by not using all the free issue energy available to them. And I think in farming, that must be the number one priority. Use what you're given free and make the most of it.
Chris?
Absolutely. And as I said earlier, we're being offered as farmers productivity support. We're being offered support to create a particular type of habitat or biodiversity. it is really quite problematic when you actually see what has happened over the last 30, 40 years. Biodiversity trends, despite the environmental payments that have been offered and taken, biodiversity trends are still downwards. That is because we haven't understood that actually natural capital, biodiversity, will randomly decide is the right word to use, will randomly create the right habitat for that particular farm in that particular landscape. And until we understand that nature is random, and if we want a particular type of biodiversity, it will require additional energy to maintain that type of biodiversity.
This is also one of the traps of the physics of energy, which hasn't emerged in farming, and that is that you cannot go back to an original starting point. Ever. Nature won't let you do it, and there's never a process for doing it. All you can do is go forward to a different place. And that's quite a different concept. And that different place will not be predictable because nature gets there by a series of random steps, many of which are determined by its starting conditions. So there are very few weapons available to predict the outcome of these processes. And what that means is that they can be disappointing. And if they are disappointing, there's a tendency to interfere to move them towards the pattern that was originally intended. Well, that's making the whole thing worse because you're now throwing even more energy at the problem than you started with.
We're going to finish the show in the usual way. Because even though this is a special episode of Meet the Farmers, it's still Meet the Farmers. So we're going to finish with the same two questions. I'm going to ask each of you one of these. Brian, I'm going to ask you, what would your message to the public be based on all this?
I think with a non-farming hat on, I think the public have to understand much better the contribution that farmers make and to help them see their role as being part of the energy sector, and to be sympathetic to any kind of initiative and program which helps to make farmers more profitable. It's the ultimate underwriting of food security.
And Chris, a message to farmers from you.
Well, not quite as succinct as Brian, I'm afraid. It's a summary, really, of what we've talked about. Measure success by your profit before support, not output before support, and move towards this sweet spot. Move to MSO, reduce your industrial energy, and you will be more profitable and nature will be optimized. Secondly, we do see that farmers that take this move are pilloried to a certain extent by their neighbors or by their farming friends at the auction mart or in the grain store or wherever it is. And because of those farmers who are doing the teasing, if you like, cannot see the P&L account, they don't understand the effect of that business. So don't worry about the criticism that you might receive. If you're going to get support, understand what you're going to use it for and use it for the right thing. And you need to be, I think the farming industry needs to be lobbying DEFRA for transitional support from wherever the farm businesses are now to where they need to be at their most profitable, to optimize nature and to minimize that net energy burden.
Fantastic. I think for me, it's going to be a big thing I'm taking away from this is actually, which I wasn't expecting actually at the end of this, but it is first and foremost, this is largely about culture shift and the way that we think about our farm businesses, the way we think about where we're going and our priorities. But priorities for nature, yes, which is the big debate that we're having as a society today and in the farming sector, but also other priorities, whether that's community, whether that's family, whether that's what else we need for our own business. And driving all of that has to be at its absolute cusp, profitability. And I think MSO provides a really, really interesting way of looking at this. And certainly any listeners who are interested in finding out more, please do go and check out Nethergill Associates website. That's nethergillassociates.co.uk. And I'm sure, Chris and Brian, that you'd be willing to speak to anyone further on the subject.
Absolutely.
Well, that is all we have time for today. We will leave it there. But huge thanks to my guests, Chris Clark and Brian Scanlon from Nethergill Associates. And like I say again, if you'd like any more information on maximum sustainable output, or you'd like to contact Chris or Brian to find out more about how Nethergill Associates can help your business, you can find their contact details in the show notes or just visit nethergillassociates.co.uk. I will see you for another episode soon. For now, though, I'm Ben Eagle. This has been Meet the Farmers. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you all have a great week.